Back in the early days of the MCU, we used to assume that certain events happened in the year their movie was released. For some reason, we couldn't stop comparing the Marvel Cinematic Universe to our actual universe, and we kind of drove ourselves crazy. Marvel Studios has retconned their timeline a few times, but made things pretty explicit in Avengers Endgame. We'll go over the timeline and let you know how it went so wrong in the past. Sure, we all know that the exciting events we see in Marvel movies don't take place in the real world, but the Marvel Cinematic Universe is so close to our own that we can't help but be obsessed with finding out what year certain events took place in, and you can't really blame us for this. Just think about how many real-world pop culture references our heroes pack into every movie. Clearly, they're trying to foster the connection between the MCU and the real world, or at least that's how we justify this weird obsession to ourselves. Now, we're going to let you know how the timeline evolved to this point, and how Avengers Endgame set the record straight about a lot of things. Back in the early days of the MCU, fans started assuming that events took place in the year movies were released. This seemed to make sense based on how closely the MCU mirrored our own much less exciting world, so this would mean Tony Stark first uttered the words "I am Iron Man" in 2008, when Iron Man hit theaters, and that would mean that the Battle of New York happened in 2012, when the Avengers was released. This rule seemed to make sense, and most of us didn't question it much until, of course, the timeline started getting mucked up, and Marvel Studios had to step in because their fans just can't enjoy things without properly quantifying them. Yeah, we might be a little bit guilty on that one too. But after phase 1, things changed, and we were told that the events in the movies were taking place closely to when they were released. For example, Captain America: Civil War, that was said to take place in the year 2016, but there were some notable exceptions. The first Guardians of the Galaxy movie was released in 2014 and the sequel came out in 2017, but seemed to take place immediately following the events of the first movie. Thankfully, Marvel Studios stepped in with an official timeline to answer all of our burning yet completely unnecessary timeline questions. It laid out events from the first time Jotunheim invaded Midgard and claimed this happened approximately 1,000 years before Tony Stark said, "I am Iron Man" for the first time. And it contained pretty much every notable major movie moment right up until the first time the Avengers assembled. The only problem with this timeline, it didn't have any actual dates on it. It told us when historical MCU moments happened in relation to one another, but not what year they occurred. So before we get too into the dates, how does time work in the MCU? Well, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a huge, constantly changing place, and while Marvel Studios is always looking to the future, they're not infallible, and they have a lot of moving parts to keep straight. Kevin Feige has even said that they try to avoid talking about specific years and dates for this reason. He claims Marvel Studios is worried about providing interesting storylines and characters instead of checking their calendars. But of course, time was a huge part of Avengers Endgame, since no small part of the film involved our heroes traveling through time. There was a time jump, and then on top of that, our heroes revisited many iconic MCU moments in order to collect the Infinity Stones and then undo the decimation, so let's examine the all-new Endgame established timeline. Some of our heroes suggested going back in time to stop Thanos from getting the Infinity Stones in the first place, but Bruce Banner patiently explained why this wouldn't work. If they went back to the past would become their future, and the former present would be the past. He claimed not to know how Scott Lang and Rhodey got their theories on time travel, but we all know the answer. Movies, the same place we get all of our ideas about time travel, come to think of it, but in the MCU, it's established that no matter how much you jump around in it, time is still linear, and there's no way around that. When our heroes travel through time, they've changed their present and future, but not their past, which is a fixed point in time. As Bruce pointed out, time in the MCU doesn't work the way it does in Back to the Future, where changing the past impacts the future. So don't be distracted by all the movies you know that mention time travel, or by all of the jargon Tony Stark throws out. Instead, focus on how to get from one point to another in the MCU. The theory of special relativity says that time and space are part of a single continuum. If you're not a huge Albert Einstein fan, you might also remember some talk of the space-time continuum from the movie Doctor Strange. We know objects have 3 dimensions: length, width, and depth, and that these dimensions can only be represented by only 2 dimensions when flattened. Tony Stark figures this out when he runs a computer simulation depicting a Mobius strip, which is a 3D shape of a single side. This serves as a model for our heroes to travel through quantum tunnels, which links the present day with a specific date in the past. The time machine he and Bruce Banner put together opens up these quantum tunnels, allowing them to travel through different points in time. Bringing the Infinity Stones from the past into the future would create offshoots of the main timeline, and as the Ancient One points out, that's a bad idea. At the end of the movie, when Thanos says that he's inevitable, he's actually right about that. Him collecting all of the Infinity Stones, completing the Infinity Gauntlet, and causing the decimation are indeed inevitable, because they already happened. Our heroes were able to reverse the decimation, but they couldn't stop it from happening in the first place because it was a fixed moment in the main timeline. If you spill a glass of milk on the floor and then pour yourself a new one, the first one's still spilled, and you should probably clean that up. The movie establishes that the Battle of New York took place in 2012. The events of Thor: The Dark World took place in 2013, and the Guardians of the Galaxy movies took place in 2014. Endgame kind of stays away from the idea of alternate timelines, and it seems as though they don't exist in the MCU. Branches can be created by removing an Infinity Stone, as the Ancient One explains, but these branches are considered unstable and dangerous, and it seems unlikely our heroes could access them via the quantum realm. They wouldn't be able to be mapped via the device that Tony Stark created, and therefore, our heroes can't get to them, even if they wanted to. So for all intents and purposes, they might as well not exist. You'll notice that Tony's device doesn't allow anyone to jump to the future, because it's undetermined and doesn't exist yet. The Thanos from 2014 who intercepts Nebula is only able to travel to 2023 because he's tagging along with Nebula, who knows how to get to that point on the timeline. And any of the unstable dimensions created while our heroes collected the Infinity Stones were undone when Captain America returned those stones to their rightful place in time. So, were there two Captain Americas in the Avengers? Yes, there was the recently unfrozen Steve Rogers fighting to save the day, and the significantly older Steve Rogers who got to live out his life with Peggy Carter. If you're still feeling a little bit confused about the timeline, don't worry, you're not alone. It's kind of a mess. And even Marvel Studios has trouble staying consistent with what events happened when. The beginning of Spider-Man Homecoming shows the cleanup from the Battle of New York, which, according to Avengers Endgame, took place in 2012. But fast forward and a title card claims Homecoming takes place 8 years after the Battle of New York, putting Homecoming in the year 2020, which doesn't make sense when you consider the timeline of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. This gets a little bit complicated, so try to follow along here as we lay out the evidence. Guardians of the Galaxy occurs in 2014 because the prologue claims it takes place in 1988 and then skips forward 26 years, which brings us to 2014. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 has a prologue taking place in 1980 and skips forward 34 years, also landing us in 2014. During an interview, Marvel Studios head Kevin Feige confirmed that Avengers Infinity War took place 4 years after Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which means it took place in 2018, and we know Spider-Man Homecoming definitely took place prior to Infinity War because Peter Parker wasn't a pile of ash for the whole movie. So clearly a mistake was made somewhere along the way, and this time it wasn't just us being bad at math. Marvel had contradicted its own timeline, and it's done so before. In Captain America Civil War, Vision claims that Tony Stark had come out as Iron Man 8 years ago. Based on some calendars we spotted in Civil War, that movie took place in 2016, meaning 8 years ago was in 2008 when Iron Man was released, but Marvel told us that movie took place in the year 2011. So which is it? Both Civil War and Homecoming had screwed up the timeline, and it was clear Marvel knew that they had made a mistake. We were so desperate to figure out what was going on, we even tried to catch a glimpse at the dates on Peter Parker's passport in the Spider-Man Far From Home trailer, but of course, the years were missing. Marvel was stonewalling us for sure, but don't think that we don't understand where they're coming from. If you're confused by when exactly things happened in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, well, Marvel Studios clearly is as well. It seems like every time they give us what we want by providing clear dates or confirming how much time has passed, it just messes up what little understanding of the timeline we already have. Marvel Studios clearly wants us to focus on what's going on in the MCU instead of worrying about when exactly things happen, which we suppose is fair considering the consistently high quality content they provide us with, but we are still going to complain a little bit. It's actually kinda crazy how much easier it is to understand the time travel presented presented in Avengers Endgame than to try to parse out the MCU timeline that has been getting established before time travel or the quantum realm were even introduced as concepts. It's possible that after totally fumbling the timeline earlier and then attaching specific dates in Endgame, Marvel will make an effort to be more consistent moving forward. At the end of the movie, we saw Peter Parker going back to school, so it looks like Spider-Man Far From Home is going to take place shortly after Endgame. We'll have to see if this Spider-Man movie messes up the timeline as badly as the last one did. What do you think about the Marvel movie timeline finally being confirmed? Are you pleased with how it was all laid out, or does it mess with your personal headcanon? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section, and then click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on the latest from CBR. Bye for now.